giant, hammer.
Right.
And it sort of crushes things, and it misses some things and crushes other things. That's why a lot of times regulations that deal with pollution tend to be very input oriented rather than output. It's really difficult if you're going to, if you're the EPA and you want to make a national regulation. Do you want to say, well, don't kill fish? That's really tough because every river is different. It's got different flows. It's got different other inputs and factors, and everything is different. But if you said, okay, well, everyone has to use the XR 457 sulfite scrubber, that works. We can all follow that, and that means in a lot of cases you still kill fish, and in a lot of cases you kill businesses, say, that aren't killing fish and can't afford and all this, this
what's
technological
a
solution.
sulfite scrubber? That's a real thing? You're not just being flippant?
No. No. It's really, and it's crazy, right? But when you take that regulatory approach, you wind up looking at inputs, not outputs. You stop thinking about what is the effect of this operation on the environment, and you start thinking about, well, how can I regulate this? What's easy for me behind a desk to sort of to regulate this? And that's another thing that Reason is very big on, and that is using performance measures, right? Let's look at actual environmental effects.
So the regulators are thinking what's best for them rather than what's best for the environment, what's best for the companies,
and
or
business
what's best for the public.
And business too. If I'm a nationwide business and I'm potentially putting things in 1,000 different streams, I prefer that kind of blanket regulation too. Hey, what's the standard? Okay, I'm meeting it, fine, good.
Okay.
Rather than don't kill fish, because that means every single river I got to go and look, and I got to figure out what's the, what is this each individual case like. And a lot of larger businesses also like things that increase costs. If I'm an established business, I don't mind, in a way, a regulation that will increase the costs of entry.
Right.
I can handle
keep
it.
the little guys out.
Yeah, it'll keep other folks from entering.
So a lot of these regulations hurt the small guy, and so they end up as kind of a regulatory corporate welfare for some of the larger
it creates
companies.
Kind of a cabal of the regulated community likes it, and the regulators like it because they can both sort of nicely fit it into a page, and they know when, okay, am I legal or not? Someone can answer it quite quickly.
Right.
Like, well,
so it keeps out, we're going back to the kind of the opposite of how it's supposed to be in America, where the little guy always has a chance to come in and compete. So we end up with the same situation, is that those are the fishing businesses, and no one else can enter, and no one else can start, and everything's a territory, and it's impossible for the little guy to get the amount of money that it takes to get into the industry.
Well, but with stronger property rights in something like fishing, if you have a strong, right now, it is tough to get into a fishery because what have you got? It's not a great business. Fisheries are declining in a lot of cases because of this regulatory approach. And in cases where they do have these stronger access rights, you've got something to take to the bank.
What about
just like it's, I can't afford a house with the income I have, but because I own it'll be a real piece of property that I own, I can leverage that and get a loan and get into something.
What is a lot of this going to the kind of farms where they're making fish in giant man-made pools? Is that why that's declining also? Are they
why fisheries are declining?
Yeah.
No. Aquaculture is competitive for a lot of fisheries, particularly salmon and some things like that, but it's unrelated to the decline in wild fisheries.
Now, what about some other examples of property rights clashing with the environment? Is there any particular thing right now that you're working on that's really of interest?
There are two big issues. We can talk about both of them. And one would be endangered species,
right?
Where we don't have property rights in species, and the Endangered Species Act actually
makes that impossible.
Limits property rights in land, because it says you cannot do anything to harm this species that's on your land, which means that people don't want endangered species on their land.
Right, which means they go out and make sure there's none on there.
Yeah, I mean, there are some,
before they build.
Anecdotes of sort of shoot, shovel, and shut up. That's the thing in the West. But it basically means we've created a real perverse incentive for a landowner. Because public lands are not very well managed, the majority of endangered species in the United States are on private land.
Oh, really?
And yet we've created this situation where we're saying, gee, if we find something on your land, we've got a whole set of regulations that you're going to have to live under. And so people say, I don't want that, which is crazy. We want the opposite, right? You should want people saying, you know, waving a big flag, saying, I'm such a good, you know, steward of my land that these endangered species, they love it.
Right.
And instead, you know, it's like, bury the flag, don't tell anyone,
and
keep quiet. And in a lot of cases, what people have actually done is altered habitat that that endangered species would like. The shoot, shovel, and shut up stuff, I'm not sure how often that's really happened.
Right.
It's a
We
little
don't
bit
know.
more of
There's
lore.
no
But economists have actually
on it.
gone out and looked at the way people manage, say, timberlands. And in some cases where they would attract an endangered species, once they got to a certain level of maturity, they cut them before they get to that level of maturity.
Right.
Right? So you're not destroying endangered species habitat, you're destroying habitat that would evolve into endangered species habitat. And you're thinking, I don't want to go there, I'm going to, you know.
And that's one of the reasons that we've seen the Endangered Species Act has not helped endangered species.
Yeah,
it's
it
backfired.
I would say it hasn't recovered any species at all. There are, I forget the exact numbers, something. Anyway, more species have gone extinct than have been recovered. But ones that have been taken off the list, it's, I can't remember, 40 odd. And of those, a lot of them were either data error, which means once they started looking, they found more of them, so they took them off. Or species that went extinct, that's not a success story.
Yes.
Or some species that have actually recovered that they've taken off the list, but some of those are like gray whales, which they stopped hunting them, I think, in the 1940s.
Right.
And a number of success stories that have been related to, say, the ban on DDT, which was thinning eggshells in some raptors, which predated the Endangered Species Act. So you'd be hard-pressed to point at the Endangered Species Act and say, well, because of that act...
Because of that.
Proponents of the Endangered Species Act would say, well, it's prevented more species from going extinct.
Is that true?
I don't know.
That's like saying this tie keeps away polar bears.
Well,
there's no polar bears around here, and I say, see how well it's working.
Yeah.
So,
well, I might not go that far, but I would say it's damning it with faint praise. I mean, if the best you can say is more species would have gone extinct, we can do better than that, right? We can. We're America. We're ingenious folk, and we can put our mind to something, and we can solve problems. And solving problems means bringing species back, not just keeping more of them from going extinct.
Why else has it failed? What's wrong with the way the law is written, and how could it be written better?
How could it be written better? Well, I mean, there's been some improvements. There's a number of environmental organizations recognize the fact that these perverse incentives are not good for species, and they help to pass something called the safe harbors, which you can, as a landowner, in the cases where you have this habitat that might attract species, you can sign a deal with the government that says, all right, look, if I provide habitat for these things and they do show up, you won't regulate me as heavily as you would have if I hadn't made the deal.
Right.
So that doesn't help someone who's already got species on their land, but it's at least a start. You know, there's a recognition that these rules, regulations, and laws are really creating perverse incentives, and that we can accomplish a lot more by changing those incentives.
Right.
You know.
So you talked a little bit about ownership of animals and the, I mean, I've never heard of an endangered cow, because people own them and it's profitable for people to own them. Has that rule keeping people from owning species that are endangered, has that aggravated the problem?
Yeah, certainly, I think so. I mean, you don't want them. There's, in Texas, for example, the wildlife laws are such that, like most states, the native game is sort of the king's game, and it's the property of the state. So the deer and the other things like that are managed by the state of Texas. But in Texas, if you put exotic species on your land, then you own those species. There's no question about that. And a lot of people have gotten into raising exotic species there. And in some cases, they've even sent animals back to Africa to help replace depleted species over there.
Elephants?
They own those species. No, not elephants.
No elephants yet? But would that be illegal? Could a person decide,